Welcome back, everybody. We are now in session 7 of this 2-day commission meeting, and I'm very pleased to welcome our two guests, Ruth Macklin and Robert Temple. And I will briefly introduce both of them. They are widely known and respected, and will present us with two different views on the topic of trial design and international standards. Ruth Macklin is professor of bioethics in the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. She currently co-directs an NIH Fogarty International Center training program in research ethics, which takes place in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She is a member of the Research Protocol Review Panel in the Human Reproduction Program at the WHO, and she also serves on the Vaccine Advisory Committee at WHO. She has published more than 200 scholarly articles and chapters in bioethics, law, medicine, philosophy, and the social sciences. She's also author or editor of 11 books, including Against Relativism and most recently, Double Standards in Medical Research in Developing Countries. Ruth, welcome. I will also introduce Dr. Robert Temple, who is Deputy Center Director for Clinical Science at the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. He is acting director of the Office of Drug Evaluation, which oversees the regulation of cardiorenal, neuropharmacological, and psychopharmacological drug products. Dr. Temple has a long-standing interest in the design and conduct of clinical trials and has written extensively on this subject, especially on the choice of control groups in clinical trials, evaluation of active control trials, trials to evaluate dose response, and trials using enrichment designs. He also has a long-standing interest in the hepatotoxicity of drugs. I have to confess, I'm not sure what that is. Liver, okay. I now know what that means. I should have known that. Having participated in the first detailed FDA-NIH outside discussion of the subject in 1978. Look forward to both your presentations. Ruth, would you please begin?
Thank you very much. Whoops, what happened to this?
There you go.
Okay. I'm going to have one very simple message, and the simple message is to defend a single ethical global standard, or a single global ethical standard. That's a simple message, but understanding it and interpreting it is not so easy. So there are some complications. The first complication is what counts as an ethical standard. How would you frame the statement? How would you frame the standard that you claim, that one might claim to be a single global standard? So I'm going to give a couple of candidates for such standards, and I'm going to throw them out, reject them, I mean. One candidate for a single standard might be phrased as follows. If it's unethical to carry out research with a particular design in a developed country or an industrialized country, it is unethical to do that same research in a developing country. That's one candidate for how one would compare in the design, the research design in a developing and developed country. Well, I argue that that's flawed because the particular circumstances can be sufficiently different to warrant different designs. So, for example, and this is the example I'm going to use twice, research on a preventive or therapeutic method that could be used or is designed to be used in remote rural areas with poor infrastructure could require an experimental intervention or comparator that would not be used in an industrialized country. And I want to point out here and emphasize that it's the infrastructure that's the problem, the inability to conduct the trial or to bring the products of the trial. Here's a second example that I'm going to throw out. Another candidate for single standard in research design might be phrased as follows. All participants in research should receive the level of care they would receive in a developed country. Now, some people around the table may recognize that statement. I'm not sure anybody has ever argued for it, but this is flawed for basically the same reason as the previous one, because adherence to this requirement would make it impossible to do research designed to develop treatments for some diseases or some conditions, again, in remote rural areas of developing countries. Or even if they're not rural areas, they're places even in a city where the infrastructure simply doesn't allow you. You might need an ICU, for example, an intensive care unit. So such research, however, is critically important to test interventions that can benefit people in countries with poor health infrastructures. So these are some of the reasons why those descriptions or those interpretations of a single ethical standard will not work. So let me turn to placebos, because that's the area in which Bob Temple and I have grappled on many occasions, and the one that seems to raise, it's not the only research design question, but seems to raise the most controversy. And here is the double standard position. Placebo controls are acceptable in developing countries where many people lack access to proven interventions. And the ethical defense is that subjects are not made worse off than they would be if they were not enrolled in the research at all, since the placebo control group would get the placebo, which would be, let's say, equivalent to nothing, and the other half would get an experimental product that may or may not work. A second point is that this is the defense of double standards, a costly proven intervention would never be available to the population. So why include it, according to this argument, as an arm in the study if it's never going to be available? And the final point, and this is boiling down the argument to the barest essentials, is that research subjects are treated equitably. Now, what does equitably mean here? The argument is they receive the level of care that patients in the same community receive for the same disease or same condition. That may be nothing if it's a placebo-controlled trial. So this is basically the argument that people are not being made worse off, and the question is whether that's a minimal ethical standard, or let's call it the minimalist view of ethics, that you're not making people worse off, even if you might design the trial in such a way that they could be made better off. Here's the single standard position on placebos. This holds that the same standards, again, standards for use of placebo, in the sponsoring industrialized country should be applied in the resource-poor country. And here the statement is, if patients in a developing country who are not enrolled in a clinical trial would receive no treatment, that alone cannot justify withholding an effective treatment from subjects in the research, if in fact one could design the research appropriately. I mean, there are some premises here. That is, that you have adequate research design that can provide answers. So that's the underlying premise. That is, that the science is sufficient to be able to obtain answers. So the third point, placebos may not be used in a control group in the poor country when an effective treatment for that condition exists in the industrialized country. So the question of justice here is global justice. On the previous slide, I said local justice, meaning that the people who are in the trial would be treated equitably according to local circumstances, but now we're looking at something broader, and that's global justice. So I'm not sure how much the commissioners are completely familiar with the international guidelines, since we are talking about standards. So the next few slides are simply going to pull out what the international guidance, several international guidance documents say about research design. Declaration of Helsinki in 2008, the benefits, risks, burdens, and effectiveness of a new intervention must be tested against those of the best current proven intervention, except in the following circumstances. And the first circumstance, these are probably better known than some of the other guidelines. The first circumstance is the use of placebo or no treatment is acceptable in studies where no current proven intervention exists. This is non-controversial. Nobody rebuts that. However, here's the tricky part, and this is my italics that I inserted, where for compelling and scientifically sound methodological reasons, the use of placebo is necessary to determine the efficacy or safety of an intervention, and the patients who receive placebo or no treatment will not be subject to any risk or serious or irreversible harm. Now, the reason I italicize those words, compelling and scientifically sound methodological reasons, is precisely because experts may disagree on what is compelling and what is scientifically sound. So there is where some of the debate is going to lie, not so much with the first issue, because the first question, if there are no treatments, there's no problem with using placebo. So it's in the analysis and determination of what are those compelling and scientifically sound reasons. Here is the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, their statement of a single standard. In externally sponsored research, the ethical standards applied should be no less stringent than they would be for research carried out in the sponsoring country. So this is now a statement about an international standard, or a global standard, but it's not enough clarity on what constitutes standards. The UNAIDS document, which is a companion document to the one that Mitchell Warren talked about this morning, here's what they say. This is their comment on control groups. The use of a placebo control arm is ethically acceptable in a biomedical HIV prevention trial only when there's no HIV prevention modality of the type being studied that's been shown to be effective in comparable populations. Here, however, and they do give a couple of examples, a vaccine that's not known to be effective against the virus that's prevalent, or a microbicide shown to be effective for vaginal intercourse but not for rectal intercourse. So it can be different populations, it can be a different product. So those are examples that can show when it would be possible or acceptable to use placebo. I'm going to skip this because the time is running, and go to the ICH-GCP, which is not an ethics document, but this section of their efficacy section has this to say: in cases where an available treatment is known to prevent serious harm, such as death or irreversible morbidity in the study population, it's generally inappropriate to use a placebo control. Note that it says generally. In other situations where there's no serious harm, it's generally considered ethical to ask patients to participate in a placebo-controlled trial, even if they may experience discomfort as a result. And here are the two ethical points: provided the setting is non-coercive and patients are fully informed about available therapies and the consequences of delaying treatment. So my last slide here, next to the last slide, is a statement from this European group. And this is the point at which I want to emphasize, which is that economics alone should not be the determinant of whether or not one may use a placebo in a poor country. The European group says, research activities involving human subjects cannot exclusively be assimilated to an economic activity subject to market rules. On the contrary, in the context of solidarity, regarding health as a public good rather than as a commodity, it needs to be regulated according to fundamental principles. The general approach chosen within this opinion is that fundamental ethical rules applied to clinical trials in industrial countries are to be applicable everywhere. So that's the global one single standard. And my conclusions, I had one more slide, sorry. The basic value underlying the defense of a single ethical standard is global justice, and the disparity in economic circumstances is not a morally relevant factor for determining ethical standards for research design when the external sponsor is a wealthy country or a pharmaceutical company. And in my critique of double standards, concludes that financial inequalities, to endorse double standards would be to include that financial inequalities should be a significant determinant of global justice in the design of research.
Thank you, Ruth. Robert?
Now, okay. Let me just say preliminarily that the main issue in a lot of this is turns on what the consequence of not getting the standard therapy is. That'll come up repeatedly. The major concerns in all this about the use of placebo are two main issues. One is there's a general concern about the use of placebos, mostly raised by the 2000 Declaration of Helsinki. I'll touch on that. And then the fundamental question of what a person in a trial is entitled to, best local versus best global therapy, all of which Ruth has touched on. And a second important issue on the case where being deprived of the therapy could have consequences to the patient that are serious is where this is being done and whose interest the trial is serving, and I'll try to get to those. Uh-oh, sorry, I screwed up. Thanks. In symptomatic conditions, this is a longer story, I'll be glad to dilate on it later if you want. In symptomatic conditions, with very few exceptions, only a trial showing a difference between treatments is going to be interpretable. If you merely see no difference, that is so-called, what is sometimes called equivalence or non-inferiority, in symptomatic conditions, it's usually impossible to determine whether the drug in fact worked. We have a long guidance out on non-inferiority studies. This was also addressed in the ICH document E10. The main trouble is with symptomatic conditions, you don't know whether the supposed active control actually had the effect it was supposed to have in the trial. A typical example is depression, where drugs we are quite sure work beat placebo about 50% of the time. So if you do a trial and you see no difference from the active control in a depression trial, how do you know whether this was a trial that could tell or a trial that couldn't tell the difference between active and inactive treatments? So with exceptions, symptomatic conditions generally need to show a difference. You can be better or you can beat a placebo. That's what you have to do. So in 2000, when the World Medical Association essentially banned placebos, whenever there was a known effective therapy, as Ruth showed you, if there's no effective therapy, placebos are fine. Had people followed that advice, there would have been no more development of symptomatic treatments if there was an existing therapy. Now, some people would say if the new therapy isn't better than the old ones, who cares anyway? But we can go into that. New treatments often have advantages that are not in the form of superiority. They may be better tolerated. There's lots of reasons. They may have additive effects when you study them later. You do want new symptomatic treatments in general. So let me just go quickly through the declaration. So from the very beginning, at least as early as 1975, the declaration said in every medical study, every patient, including those in control, if any, should be assured of the best proven diagnostic and therapeutic method. It's always been unclear to me what they meant by that. Because even in an active control trial, people aren't getting the best therapy, they're getting something somebody wants to test. Anyway, so there were some people, notably Rothman and Michaels, in a pretty famous New England Journal of Medicine article in 1995, said that means if there's an existing therapy, you can't use a placebo. And you know, in arguments on stages, Ken Rothman said you can't test the new drug for baldness because there was Rogaine. You can't have a placebo-controlled trial of baldness or seasonal allergic rhinitis. You just can't ever do it. It's unethical and unacceptable. Of course, as I said, read literally, the active control trial also doesn't give people a known effective therapy. So as a result, nobody took this particularly seriously until 2000. When, as Ruth showed you, it now said the benefits, risk burdens, et cetera, have to be compared. You can use a placebo when there's no known therapy, but otherwise, it clearly says you can't. So that means if there's an existing therapy in allergic rhinitis, baldness, whatever it is, you cannot do a placebo-controlled trial. Everybody noticed. IRBs were very concerned because they thought you wouldn't be able to do trials anymore. Sorry. Okay. After a lot of concern by FDA, HHS, and a lot of people, the World Medical Association eventually changed it. They made a mistake initially. They said we're for compelling, this was in 2001, they said we're for compelling methodological reasons it was necessary to use a placebo, or where a prophylactic diagnostic was being investigated for a minor condition. Well, that's not right. That first one is grossly unethical. That says if you can't get information except with a placebo-controlled trial and you have to kill a lot of people to get that information, it's okay. That's wrong. They fixed it. In 2000, it now lumps those two together, and it basically says, if no harm will come to people, you've seen this already, so I won't repeat it. If no serious harm will come to people, and if it's methodologically necessary, placebo-controlled trials are okay. That's what it says as of 2008, and I think there's pretty general agreement that that's okay. ICHE 10 in 2000, in my view, got it quite right, and it said the principal issue in use of placebos is the ethical one. There's no issue when there's no effective therapy. The question is, when is it acceptable not to give existing therapy to people and randomize them to drug or placebo? And I underlined available because that's what it said. In cases where available therapy is known to prevent severe harm, you cannot use a placebo. The generally, by the way, was a hedge word, I remember it because I threw it in, referred to cases where the treatment is so toxic that people won't take it. So low-dose AZT was tested against placebo because nobody would take the high dose. So that was the only exception. It wasn't meant to hedge too much. In other situations where there's no serious harm, and there, Zeke Emanuel says, well, serious harm, irreversible harm, those are all ambiguous. I don't think it's that ambiguous. If it's really bad for people not to get an available drug, you mustn't not give them a placebo. And there could be arguments about how much vomiting is unacceptable. We all agree ICHE 10 says that. Where there is no serious harm, it's generally considered ethical to ask patients to participate in a placebo-controlled trial, even if they may be uncomfortable. You have to give them adequate information. They can't be coerced. One could raise debates about how much money is coercive. Perfectly good question. And it points out whether a particular placebo-controlled trial will be acceptable to subjects and investigators could be debated. And one country might conclude one thing about highly emetogenic chemotherapy, and another place might think something else. And of course, the patient is supposed to be informed enough to know. This is now more or less what the declaration says. ICHE 10 refers to available therapy. It's no accident they didn't address the question of whether available meant in that country or all over the world, because that was just too hard. They didn't want to get into, we didn't want to get into the best local versus best global. So under ICHE 10, however, this whole issue is only of interest when you're talking about a treatment that prevents serious harm. Because those are the treatments that would ordinarily have to be given if they were available. Symptomatic treatments are probably not an issue, and I don't think there's much controversy on that. So suppose the treatment really is important. And we actually discussed this at a WA meeting, and I would say there was a fair amount of agreement on what I'm about to tell you, but we'll see what you think. So suppose a clinically important treatment is not available in a developing country. That actually can happen in a developed country where the country chooses not to approve a treatment. That's happened from time to time. But let's also suppose, you have to stipulate this, that a comparison study comparing some new treatment with the established treatment would not be informative, that this is a case where you have to have a placebo to have it be interpretable. And that could be debated too, but the issue doesn't arise in that case. If a non-inferiority study is available, you just do the non-inferiority study. So, can you study a new drug with the same therapeutic goal as existing therapy in a developing country where the standard of care is not available? And I think there are two distinct cases. One is the one Ruth referred to, where the trial clearly serves the interest of the country because they can't deliver the standard therapy. They don't have the clinics, they don't have the techniques. The other is where the trial is being done solely because of a commercial interest. Someone wants to make use of the fact that the drug is not available in that country to do a placebo-controlled trial that would plainly not be acceptable in his own country. Okay. And you can get into whether he plans to market the drug in the other country and all that stuff. So let's consider those two issues. The general view at the WMA, and I think Ruth referred to this as the things that she worried about being excluded, was if you could say that the country needed the information, that it was important to them, and they needed to know the results, and the results, remember, couldn't be obtained with an active controlled trial, it was okay to do the trial. The famous HIV transmission study, which got a lot of discussion, is a good example of that. If it's true that a non-inferiority study would not have been informative, and as Ruth and I were just discussing, that a historical controlled experience wouldn't have been informative, the only way to find out whether short course HIV was effective was to do the placebo-controlled study. And that's why Barmas and Satcher wrote that it was okay. The disagreement was largely from Wolf and Lurie because they thought an active control trial would have been acceptable. And I don't agree with that, but that's not the philosophical argument. Another example, we've been talking about the use of rectal artesunate, where it really would have been better to just give, IV quinine or something. And in general, this refers to any therapy really needed by the country that they have good reason to get. So the thought there, I think the general agreement was that it would be acceptable not to give this therapy that was available in the advanced country because you had no choice, it couldn't be given. Briefly take the other.
Robert, I'm going to just
Okay.
ask you to try to wind up in a minute. If you
I can-
think
I-
I need to give
I can do that.
people- You'll have a chance to answer questions.
Okay. The other case is the famous surfactant case, which I won't dwell on, where the purpose of the trial plainly was to get it marketed in the US. There was good reason to believe that nobody in the trial would be worse off than they would have been without the trial, but they clearly would not have gotten standard therapy. Most people did not feel comfortable with that approach. It was not for the purpose of the country. It was so that somebody could get the data and go market the drug in the United States. I just want to pose the question that having abandoned that trial, which the company did under publicity, it's very clear that more babies died in Latin America than would have died if the trial had happened. Now, nobody seems to be bothered by that, but it seems worth thinking about because they weren't getting the drug. And I think that may be my end. Okay, we've sort of addressed this. Okay.
Thank you very much. This is an active issue for us to consider, and I want to open it up to commission members to make comments or ask questions. I'll begin let me just ask both of you, because you've no doubt read the sounding board response, the ethics of placebo-controlled trials, a middle ground, that was in the New England Journal, co-authored by Ezekiel Manuel and Franklin Miller. It would be helpful for us if we could hear your response. Robert, to you, the authors say psychological and social harm caused by depression, for example, are either not considered or dismissed. In other words, when you began to address this, but what actually, how broad do you want us to interpret harm? And I'll just pose the complementary. There are many questions here, but this suggests a middle ground. Just for us to understand how far apart you really are. Ruth, the co-authors say that the dichotomy you propose between rigorous science and ethical protections is false. Scientific validity constitutes a fundamental ethical protection. I'm sure you would agree with that. But here is that if placebo controls are necessary or desirable for scientific reasons, that constitutes an ethical reason to use them, although it may not be a sufficient reason, it is a reason. So if I start, either one of you, if you could just say where you see the common ground lacking here, because it does seem like once you take into account the need for scientific validity, which is an ethical consideration, we believe, and once you take into account a range of harms that would be serious harms, there's not, it's at least hard for me to see why we can't agree on this middle ground from both your perspectives, unless you really are orthodox, as orthodox as this suggests you are. You want to start, Ruth, and then we'll do Robert?
I should say that where I stand with regard to that claim and the article, I am not a defender of active control orthodoxy. The middle ground is between placebo control orthodoxy and active control orthodoxy.
Correct.
I accept the middle ground, I accept the arguments, and I also accept the examples that Bob gives of the circumstances in which he refers to as the symptomatic cases, in which you really can't tell whether it's the disease, the remission, the disease. I accept all of that. So and the middle ground actually tries to work between those two,
Right.
and that's the middle ground. So that's where I stand on that
Okay.
issue.
Okay.
Where let me say, the other thing is, I think there may not be agreement on what are the scientifically and methodologically compelling reasons to use placebo. And so the challenge there is to see whether there
Okay.
are other methodologists who might challenge Bob's view on when a trial might be uninformative in the non-symptomatic cases.
Fair enough. Very good. That's very helpful to us.
There might be somebody who would do that, but we haven't been exposed to them. I think there's broad agreement that if, under the circumstances, we say an active control is not informative. I mean, we just wrote a long guidance on this, 40 pages of stuff to people to disagree with if they want to. We have not had disagreements with the fundamental principle. We've had disagreements about some of the edges. I didn't feel that Zeke described a middle ground at all. I think he described what exactly our position was. If you really believe that, yeah, Susan and I talked about that considerably. We didn't think there's, and it reads like E10 to me. If you really believe that not getting an antidepressant is going to be dangerous, if you have evidence to that, then you can't study new antidepressants. Put it away. We totally agree. The question is whether that's true. And if you look at, thousands of depression trials, you won't see an increased suicide rate in the people who didn't get treated. You actually see increased suicidality in the people who are treated. He didn't know that at the time he wrote that. That's more recent news. But if there's a risk, even a low risk, of something bad happening, then you can't do it. We agree with that. His example of severely emetogenic chemotherapy. We've always been troubled by that and thought that was at the edges. If it keeps you from getting your chemotherapy, you have to either not do it, design around it, or something like that. And there are ways to make the period during which a person is miserable and suffering shorter. You can have your endpoint be the first sign of something instead of having to vomit for hours and hours. You don't have to do that. In the case of severely emetogenic chemotherapy, actually, I'm quite sure you could do an active control trial. But don't mistake that for thinking that all studies work. There's been a review of studies of ondansetron, which is the way you prevent emesis. And in dozens and dozens and dozens of studies, it failed to beat placebo when it was being used post-surgically. And the reason was simple: the people didn't vomit, so you couldn't show an advantage. So in emetogenic chemotherapy, you probably could use a non-inferiority study. There's a legitimate question about whether people should be exposed to this kind of misery. That's a perfectly good question. I don't know what the orthodoxy is. Everybody acknowledges that. So I'm comfortable with his position.
We're very pleased to hear that. We're not going to settle every scientific dispute about particular studies, but if there is a ground that the two of you agree on, that's an important step forward. So let me call on Christine Grady.
To say one thing, I don't think Ruth and I differ on very much. Probably the one thing is the surfactant case, where I'm not so sure that's really wrong, and that deserves discussion, but I realize most people don't agree with me. So I know that.
Yeah, but there will be, we could all agree on all the standards at a level of specificity and still disagree on particular cases because of specifying the facts and the counterfactuals. So that's extremely important what the two of you have just said in response to my question. Let me go on, Christine.
Thank you both. I think my question follows a little bit on Amy's in a certain way, although I was thinking of it in a different way before she started. You both have been through the war, so to speak, in terms of this controversy. And it sounded like from each of your presentations that with now many years after the debates began and the changes to Helsinki and the E10 and the literature that's been, available to sort of carve middle grounds, that actually the disagreement between you is hardly there at all. And so I guess the question that I would have is, at this juncture in history, what do you think needs to be done to sort of put this question to bed, so to speak? I mean, what's still out there that's troubling people in terms of this question about placebo-controlled or standard of care? Or do you think we should put our energy somewhere else? I guess that's part of the question.
Well, I do think we should put our energy somewhere else, but I think it doesn't help to revisit the 076, that controversy, because people are entrenched and don't like to give up their positions, whatever position they took. So that's not helpful. New examples.
It's not helpful to go back to those people who are entrenched, but that, if you ask a lot of educated people who are following this debate, that's where a lot of people think this is in this debate, not where the two of you are now.
I think what we have to, in order to answer the question, what is the remaining disagreement between Bob and me? Now, if it comes down to the surfactant trial, there was later an active control surfactant trial that was done, not a placebo-controlled trial. This is not one of those cases of the symptomatic trial, of the symptomatic situation. So the defense that Bob gave was fewer babies. Yeah, some babies died that wouldn't otherwise have died if the trial had been done. But the question that arises is, why wasn't an active control trial done? Why could it not have been done? Would it not have yielded scientific information? And that's what I didn't hear. That's, it seems to me.
No, but I'll tell you, we concluded, and whether this is right in some sense doesn't matter, but we concluded that showing equivalence to the existing animal bovine-derived surfactant would not be persuasive because some of the trials of the initial surfactant had not been successful, even though we all know it's a wonderful therapy, it saves babies' lives. What they eventually did was beat a synthetic surfactant, which probably isn't as good as the actual surfactant. So they were able to do a superiority trial. A superiority trial would always have been acceptable. No one would have ever doubted that. But a non-inferiority trial to the bovine surfactant would not have been interpretable. Again, I'm not, all that knowledgeable about the trial, so I don't know if that's true. All I would say is, though, is that if that is true, then you needed to do a trial show difference. By the way, they would never have done a superiority trial in the Latin American countries. They would have done it in the US. So that trial would never have gone there because, among other things, we would have been less certain about the applicability to the US. We worry about that. So it really is a case where the trial they wanted to do could not have been done in the US. Nobody disagrees about that. And it really focuses on whether, it really is, sort of depends on whether you focus on the people in the trial and how they are, or how you feel about what it tells you about the world that you can do that trial there. And I'm into social justice, but you got to think about the people in the trial too. I think that's the tension.
John.
Okay, so Bob, I'm detecting a bit of a tension within your presentation. Okay, so earlier in your presentation, you did make a distinction that I think you thought was important between studies that were done for the benefit of the local population versus studies that are done simply to, get approval back here and market the drug here, right? So, but then near the end, and just now, you seem to float a very different sort of standard. which is what you might want to call a kind of Pareto standard. You know, if people are made better off and nobody's made worse off, then it's okay to do the study, okay? So there is, I think, a tension between those two sorts of standards, because you could say, well, you know, the fact that some people will benefit, you know, if the trial is done, that's not a decisive reason if that first principle is really paramount, namely needed within the local community, needed in that country's public health structure. So could you discuss that a little bit? I mean, how do you reconcile those two? Because it could be that you could just go with the second, right?
No.
Okay.
The distinction is between what the consequence of not getting the standard therapy is. If it's a symptomatic condition where the only consequence of not getting the standard therapy is you're symptomatic, I think that's okay anywhere you want to do it. And for what it's worth, I didn't mention this, the sorts of trials that people do of depression in Eastern Europe and elsewhere are the very same trials they do at home. So everybody's treated the same and nobody comes to harm. I have no trouble with any of those wherever you do them. There are people who are uncomfortable about how many trials are being farmed out to poorer parts of the world. A separate question. I have not been addressing that. This arises where there is clearly harm from not getting the standard of care. And there I want to make the distinction between, this isn't necessarily my position, but everyone is quite comfortable with the idea that where doing the trial and not giving the standard therapy is very much in the interest of the country, because they'll get a treatment to prevent HIV transmission that ain't the best, but it's pretty good, or they'll treat malaria better than they otherwise could have, even if it's not the best. Everybody, I thought, at WMA was very comfortable with that. What they're not comfortable with is my thought that maybe it's okay to do a trial if everybody in the trial is at least as well off as they otherwise would be. People in general are not comfortable with doing that in, say, Latin America in order to market a drug in the US. Okay, and I think it's the social injustice that they don't like the fact that you'd have to do a trial like that you could even get to do a trial like that in those countries. They resent the disparity of wealth and things like that, all of which are perfectly legitimate. I just think it's also important to think about the people in the trial, because they would have been better off.
Well, yeah, and if you were a parent of a child with that kind of lung condition, you probably would want your child in that study.
I think you would, and they did. That's why they wanted to do the trial.
Christine, quickly, because we have a hard stop, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to
I know
follow
Christine
up.
wanted to follow.
Because it seemed like the disagreement about surfactant has to do more with what some people call responsiveness or, you know, local needs than it does with the design of the trial, the placebo. So is that right? I mean, is the placebo question settled and we have to worry about these other things like whether or not responsiveness matters? Or do we still have work to do on agreeing on when placebo is okay and not okay?
See, I think to approach the ethical issue, you should assume that you, in fact, did need to do a placebo-controlled trial to get information. I mean, if you could do an equivalence trial, then the issue doesn't arise. If you could find a loser surfactant to beat, then the issue doesn't arise, although you wouldn't do it in Latin America. The issue arises where, for one reason or another, let's assume it's true, you really can't do an equivalence trial. And no one will let you do a placebo-controlled trial where the drug is available, because harm would come to people. You know, there's a million drugs. Oh, yeah. Suppose I want to know whether a new ACE inhibitors, angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors, prevent death in heart failure. Okay, how do I get a new ACE inhibitor? How do I get that claim if I'm a new ACE inhibitor? Well, I can't do an equivalence trial for a variety of reasons, and the main reason is therapy has marched on, and now everybody gets a beta blocker and spironolactone in addition to the ACE inhibitor. So I don't know what the effect of the ACE inhibitor is. I can't do the non-inferiority margin. So I can't do that. But I could go to a country where there are no ACE inhibitors and show that the ACE inhibitor works compared to placebo. Is that a good idea? Well, maybe if everybody's better and everybody gets a spironolactone and a beta blocker and a diuretic and they're better off than they currently are, and you compare added ACE inhibitor with placebo, I'm not sure I'd object to that trial, but that's where the issue. There's a million things you can't study anymore because an equivalence trial is uninformative and you can't deprive people of a known therapy that saves your life.
This has been enormously helpful to us, and I think is an example of how bringing two people who have sparred but are very thoughtful and responsive
We like
can
each-
make,
we
can
like
make
each
a
other.
difference. So on behalf of the whole commission and everybody present, we thank you very much.